feel about it now? I mean, you know, you've gone through that process because you wrote this book. The adventure finished in 2021. Is that right? Or what year it is? 2022.
Yeah. So I wrote it. I got commissioned in 2020, just as we went into lockdown, and then handed it in 2021, a year later. So yeah.
Yeah, and so obviously we've had like a good year now of you kind of being kind of out and released and people reading it and responding to it. And you said just very previously then, and you actually mentioned it when we were talking beforehand as well, like, you know, I'm not an expert, I'm not that person, but how do you feel about the work that you produce now? Do you still feel that way? Are you empowered about the fact that you're not an expert?
I think so. I think it's quite fun not being an expert. I think I've got more confident in, I'm very happy to admit that I'm not an expert at all, but I think I know that I can, perhaps, I know that it's very difficult, I'm finding it very difficult without sounding really kind of, to say that I'm a good translator between science and the public. And I really enjoy that challenge, I enjoy that problem solving of here's a very complicated paper that has loads of information and data and numbers and stuff that we need to know, but what are like the top 3 things that the public need to know about this? What does the everyday person who's busy, on a budget, stressed, tired, got a family to feed, you know, but worried about climate change, what do they need to know from this paper? And so I love that problem and how to try and solve it. And so I've been completely overwhelmed that I'm here still talking about it. People still want me to talk about it, but I think I knew the book was going to be topical, but the world has changed so much since it came out. I mean, in the last few months, you know, with COP27 and an extreme heat wave and wildfire and drought and loads of things going on to be worried about. So I'm very surprised and taken aback by how it's becoming even more topical, because all of this is happening and yet still we are in danger of forgetting what's on our doorstep. The species that uphold ecosystems, and we only know the value, that we're in real danger of only understanding their value when they're gone, and we can't go back. And so the urgency of the messages and the science and what the species, each 10 species is a gateway to a wider conversation, whether it's green energy or soil health or regen farming or extreme weather. And so what these species and their scientists are representing is becoming more and more urgent to me. And so I feel very privileged to have been able to tell their story, and I feel very proud to still be in a position to be able to relay their messages to audiences. So yeah, I feel proud, is the short answer.
It's a great answer. I think that was actually going to be one of my questions that I had kind of planned later, actually, and you sort of covering it, so let's just bring it in now, was in each of the chapters, although, you know, you'll start talking about like dung beetles, for instance, you never talk about the species just in isolation. There's always this massive network where you move out and you talk about harbour porpoise and their interaction with like offshore wind, for instance, and you talk about as you're driving in your BMW i3, it was a borrowed
yeah.
BMW i3, how the kind of mining of lithium batteries has an impact on certain species. And so you constantly create this interconnected web of not just, it's so cleverly done. And I think my question here, actually there's so many questions I could ask thinking about it, but one of my big questions is about that like creative element of kind of pulling all of these ideas together and sort of really being able to see that interconnection between all of these things. How did you go into this with that in mind, or was that as you were kind of going through the projects and meeting people, and how did you pull that together?
It's a really good question, because it was a real concern I had before I started, because I thought, well, how can I talk about 10 species and all the things I want to talk about in between without it reading like 10 short stories? And yes, you can read the chapters in isolation, but they do work, they make way more sense if you read them 1 to 10. And so it was kind of a problem that I was really worried about at the very beginning, but then I hadn't started yet. And so once I started to figure out how to build each chapter, which involved the travel, which was the huge kind of a saviour in a way, narratively speaking, because it allowed me to have an undercurrent of something really consistent all the way through. We've just had a really like heavy bit about, I don't know, failing seas and ocean acidification. Let's go back to the travel. Where are we on the journey? What am I eating? Am I tired? Have I fallen into a hedge? Probably. That was really helpful in terms of laying a foundation for the basis of each chapter. And then we interviewed the scientists. So I interviewed about, I think it was in total over 70 scientists and researchers and experts who supplemented my lack of knowledge at the beginning. I didn't know anything about any of these species really before I started, because it was so important for me to be learning with the reader as mates along the way, and us to be on that journey together. And so there were loads of different elements to each chapter, but then what was really exciting and interesting was suddenly all these connections started to appear, and I could start to call back to, oh, we've learned about this in Harbour Porpoise, so you should be familiar now. And so from 1 to 10, we're kind of building our tolerance to not only hard subjects, but then we're able to refresh and be like, oh yeah, well, we've learned about that, so we don't need to go into it again. We can go on to something else, or you're ready now to learn about this, or let's, go down this sort of alley of understanding. And so nature is the amazing thing that it is. It shows how little we understand it. It built those connections for me. And so I didn't end up having to be so worried about it, because it reminded me how unbelievably interconnected the natural world is. And all these problems have so many domino effects that kind of blend, and climate change became almost this, I want to say beautiful, because it's fascinating, because it's not just rising temperatures equals this, or warming seas equals this. It's this multifaceted, dynamic being that has so many different ways of affecting species. Sometimes it benefits some species, which was a pleasant surprise. So it's not always doom and gloom. And so to be able to spend time and allowing the species and their narratives and their stories to breathe a bit, and then supplementing that with the voices of the scientists, those connections started to appear really organically. And so it really helped my understanding of piecing it all together as an actual one-story book, to kind of attack it with a fairly systematic process.
And just what you've said there, the fact that you allow these species to breathe and really look at it from the ecological point of view of, everything is connected, and even yourself, although you are the focus in a lot of ways because we're following your journey, you are definitely in and amongst all of these species, you're in and amongst all the scientists, and kind of moving off that. I apologise, everybody, I'm quite scatterbrained, so often as Sophie's talking,
it's great. Well, the book's quite scatterbrained as well, so it works well.
And you just said then that you preserve the voices of the scientists, and you do. That's one of the greatest things. I've read a lot of nature writing where it's kind of like, it's pre-seed, it's developed by the writer, but you literally will have word for word that each of the scientists' quirks, and you talk about them as people as well. So this isn't just a book that's about the species, it's about the projects and the people that are really involved and interconnected in the saving. And I guess a question to kind of move us on from this is, why these species, why these projects, why there's so much that you could have focused on. How did you get to just 10, and why these?
Well, it's very difficult to choose 10, because obviously there are way more than 10 species in need of this kind of attention. It was. I think I did it in a couple of days, where I was just like, right, let's Google rare species in Britain and see what we come up with. But I knew that my vague criteria is that I wanted species that not many people knew about. So I didn't know what a merlin was. I'd watched the TV series Merlin, loved it.
Not the same.
I'll throw back. But didn't know that there was a bird called a merlin. And so those sorts of things were very important. I wanted species that took me to different corners, fairly representative corners of Britain, that took us to all kinds of contrasting habitats. And then I wanted species that would really demonstrate the weird and wonderful ways I was saying a minute ago about how climate change can affect a life history, an ecology, the way a species will live. And then I wanted species that would represent different taxa, so birds, insects, one habitat, seagrass. And there's a disproportionate number of insects in there, because I wanted to show how disproportionately insects are affected by climate change. The book begins and ends with an insect, because I thought, well, so does life in many ways. Begins and ends with the species right at the bottom. So I enjoyed the kind of structural creativity of how can we reflect sort of the subtext there. But as with anything, when you speak to a scientist, especially with the Merlin, this is what was I was so close to throwing the Merlin under the bus, the metaphorical bus. I was getting so frustrated with it because there's barely any research on it. The main research came from the 80s, and every bird expert I spoke to, they were like, oh, don't do the Merlin. No one knows about Merlin. Do the goshawk. Yeah, goshawk. I was like, no. I was like, this is exactly why I need to do the Merlin. But anyway, so me and the Merlin had a bit of a tussle there, but we've come out the other side. And seagrass very nearly wasn't seagrass. It was going to be the pink sea fan.
Oh, wow.
No, wow. So exciting. Yeah, I think I read the Wikipedia page of this pink sea fan and I was like, I'm really struggling to get excited about this one. So yeah, and then any scientist was like, no, yeah, just do this one or don't do that, do this. And so I actually have a reserve list of like 15 other species that would have made the cut. But yes, I've become very fond of them all, like children. I think if I had to go back, I think I wish I included a reptile and an amphibian because their climate change links are really interesting. But yeah.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe to the Kendal Mountain YouTube channel. And for more content like this, check out the Kendal Mountain Festival player, where we have thousands of hours of adventure content, including the full hour-long interview with Sophie Pavelle. For more information, click the link in the description below.